Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. In today's video, I'm going to be doing an introductory discussion lecture into euthanasia, the idea of assisted suicide. So we'll talk about what euthanasia is, talk about the various forms of euthanasia. I'm not going to get too much into sort of the ethical complications around euthanasia. I might do a video on that later. But my intent in this video is basically to introduce the concept of euthanasia, explain the different forms, because people use the term euthanasia and think that it covers only one particular act, when in fact there are many different ways of discussing euthanasia. So with that, let's begin the discussion. So this is euthanasia. Alright. The first thing that I want to do in the discussion is to explain sort of the etymology of the word. What does euthanasia mean? Euthanasia is comprised of two parts. Eu, meaning good, and thanatos, Thanatos, which means death. So that when we talk about euthanasia, essentially what we're talking about is the ability to have a good death, right? So euthanasia basically means a good death. Alright, so pretty straightforward. What we'll be doing also, and I might do this next video, I might do this maybe in a few videos, but I have a lecture that I want to do on the philosophy of death. So I'll be doing, in the next few videos, maybe even the next video, I'll be doing a discussion into the philosophy of death. What is the philosophy of death? How do we understand death? What does death mean? The significance, types of death, so on and so forth. And that idea is called thanatology, right? It's the study of death. So thanatos meaning death, eu as a prefix meaning good, so euthanasia is a good death. Okay, so the argument then is separated, right? So we have two different camps. Before I write it down, there's two different camps. And you're going to have part of the population in one camp. You're going to have the other part of the population in another camp. It's not important which camp is better or worse than the other, which camp is right or wrong. All I'm doing here is presenting the information. I'll leave it up to you to decide which camp you're a member of. Alright, so there's those that support what's known as the sanctity of life. So there are proponents of the sanctity of life. And the question is, well, what is the sanctity of life? Well, basically, proponents of the sanctity of life, they're making the ethical claim that life is sacred, right? And by sacred, well, first let me write it down and then I'll explain it. So, the ethical view that life is sacred, right? Insofar as we're talking about life being sacred, we're saying that the existence of life in its existence, just in its existence, you can technically say in its mere existence, is a sacred thing. And insofar as it's sacred, it's a violation of that sanctity to terminate life under any circumstance, right? So that if you're talking about abortion, those who support sanctity of life would be against abortion. If you're talking about the death penalty, those who support the sanctity of life would also be against the death penalty. So if you're for abortion but you're against the death penalty, or for the death penalty but against abortion, you're not, technically speaking, a true proponent of the sanctity of life. Because the sanctity of life, and there are many people like this, say that life is sacred across the board, and to avoid any type of contradiction in their argument, and the argument that's always wielded in sort of counterexample is, well, how is it that someone is pro-life, right? They're pro-life as far as their belief with respect to a mother's ability to choose or not to choose, the child's right to life, and so on, but they're also pro-capital punishment, right? It doesn't make sense. Some argue, I'm not arguing that, but some argue, you know, you can't on the one hand say that I'm for preserving the life of a child, but I'm also for killing an individual. And of course there's counterexamples to that. It's like, well, obviously there's been an offense made, there needs to be some type of retribution or justice or punishment for that offense, and so on and so on. The sanctity of life proponent, who is remaining consistent in his or her argument, would say, I am both for the life of the child and the life of the criminal. Right? Life is sacred as such, even in this mere existence. And you can imagine what type of stance the sanctity of life person would take with respect to a discussion on euthanasia. Okay. The next group is the quality of life. Quality of life. And the quality of life says the following. The quality of life is the ethical view that life is based on the properties that make life worth living. So let's read that again. The ethical view that life is based on the properties that make life worth living. So this is the ethical view that life is based on the properties that make life worth living. Okay, and here's the key terms, right? So the quality of life argument is the ethical view that life is based on the properties that make life worth living. Now, with respect to this notion of worth, the question is, well, how are we going to classify, how are we going to make sense of the idea of life being worth living? Obviously, this idea of worth is something that's subjective, right? What might be worth living for me might not be worth living for you, which is the reason why some people have DNRs, right? Do not resuscitates. And if you have a DNR, then it says, you know, under the condition that I lapse into a coma, I do not want to be resuscitated, let me die, right? Some people don't have DNRs because they want people to make an attempt. So that one of the initial critiques against this, one might say, though it's not necessarily founded just yet because we haven't explained it, is that this idea of worth is obviously by its definition relative, right? It's subjective to the individual person. Also the idea of proper, right? Or the properties, right? So life is based on the properties that make life worth living. There's going to be some distinction and some discussion on what those properties might be, right? When we're talking about an individual's quality of life, are those properties health? Are they mental health? Are they financial well-being? Are they peace of mind? Is it surrounding yourself with friends and colleagues and loved ones? What exactly are those properties? We're not going to get into I'm not going to get into too much detail on exactly what those properties are because this is just basically an introductory discussion, very brief lecture on the idea of euthanasia, just so that there's a familiar working knowledge of what it means to talk about euthanasia, and especially the various forms and sort of the complications that arise out of that discussion. There's a group that supports the sanctity of life, and we discussed that. And then in antithesis to that, or the opposing group, the oppositional group, is the group that supports the quality of life. Okay, so that is enough of the introductory remarks, and now we'll get into the various forms of euthanasia and a more technical, just a little bit more technical discussion on the different aspects of euthanasia. All right. And I'll leave that first part up. All right. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have 5 forms. 5 forms of. We'll divide it down the middle. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.